If you look at a satellite map of the Red Sea, your eyes are immediately drawn to this one specific spot, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Right. It's impossible to miss.
Yeah, it's this maritime choke point that is, what, barely 20 miles wide?
You're only 20 miles. Yeah.
And on one side of it, you have the Middle East, and on the other, the Horn of Africa.
Exactly.
For anyone who follows global trade or, geopolitics in general, that narrow stretch of water is essentially the world's jugular vein.
Yeah, it really is.
And what our source material today makes abundantly clear is that the geopolitical weather, well, it doesn't respect maritime borders. When conflict erupts in the Middle East, the shockwaves don't just stop at the shoreline. They absolutely batter the Horn of Africa.
It is a really striking geographic vulnerability.
Yeah.
We're looking at a situation where proximity forces an undeniable economic and security tether between two incredibly complex regions.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a rather sobering but fascinating brief titled How Wars in the Middle East Affected the Horn of Africa.
A very timely document.
Very. And our mission today is to really dig into the mechanics of this relationship. We want to understand how a localized conflict across the water metastasizes into a full-blown economic crisis in Africa.
Right.
And more importantly, we're going to scrutinize the proposed playbook for how the Horn of Africa can actually bulletproof itself against that overseas chaos.
I think to set the board properly here, we need to establish the specific geographical parameters the source focuses on.
Good idea. Let's define the region.
When we discuss the Horn of Africa today, we're talking about a highly strategic cluster of countries, specifically Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya.
Okay, so we're talking about nations that hold the front row seats to the Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean. These aren't just peripheral states.
No, not at all. They hold the prime real estate, and that real estate is the crux of the thesis here.
Right.
These nations are not active participants in the Middle Eastern conflict.
Right, they're not the ones fighting.
Exactly. But their domestic economies are so deeply reliant on global maritime imports that they are structurally exposed. When a conflict flares up across the water, they don't just read about it in the news.
No.
They feel it in their supply chains, their inflation rates, and ultimately their national security.
Okay, let's unpack this. The actual mechanics of that exposure.
Mm-hmm.
We all know the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden handle a massive percentage of the world's daily shipments.
Oil, food, consumer goods.
Everything.
Uh-huh.
But when instability hits, the first thing to react isn't necessarily the shipping routes themselves, is it?
No, it's the financial apparatus surrounding them.
Right. We are talking about war risk insurance premiums.
That is the invisible hand that strikes first. Every single time.
It's fascinating.
Before a single ship is even rerouted, the maritime insurance markets react to the perceived threat.
Right, because they're the ones on the hook.
Exactly. If a shipping conglomerate wants to send a vessel through a high-risk zone, the insurers demand astronomical premiums to cover the hull, the cargo, and the crew.
And those costs don't just vanish into the ether. They are passed directly down the line to the consumer.
Without fail.
Our source points out that the nations in the Horn of Africa are heavy net importers of absolute staples. We aren't talking about luxury electronics or, sports cars.
Oh, we are talking about fundamental dietary building blocks. Wheat, cooking oil, and crucially refined petroleum products.
Fuel, which runs everything.
Right. The term for this is imported inflation, and it hits developing economies with brutal efficiency.
Brutal.
When global oil prices spike due to Middle Eastern instability, or when those insurance premiums quadruple the cost of a shipping container, the physical act of landing a ton of wheat in a port like Mombasa or Djibouti becomes significantly more expensive.
But let's pause on the human element here for a second. Because macro data on a spreadsheet is one thing, but how does a, say, 300% spike in freight costs translate on the ground?
It translates to an immediate erosion of purchasing power for the average household.
So everyday families.
Everyday families in Kenya or Ethiopia, many of whom are already allocating a really substantial portion of their income just to basic sustenance.
Right.
They suddenly find that the price of cooking oil or a loaf of bread has surged.
And it surged not because of a local drought
Yeah.
or a domestic policy failure.
Exactly. It surged because a geopolitical dispute thousands of miles away made the transit of those goods too risky. The margin for error for a standard household essentially evaporates overnight.
It really highlights just how fragile globalized supply chains become at the terminal end.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the physical infrastructure, The ports themselves.
The front doors.
Right. The source document zeroes in on the coastal lifelines.
Yeah.
We're talking about Djibouti, Berbera in Somaliland, Mogadishu in Somalia, and Mombasa in Kenya.
Front doors that rely entirely on the presumption of safe, predictable maritime corridors.
Right. So let's say the Bab el-Mandeb Strait becomes completely untenable. The shipping conglomerates look at the risk calculus and pull the plug.
Which happens.
It happens. But they don't just cancel the shipments to Europe or Asia.
No, they divert them.
They divert them. It's like a major highway suddenly getting blocked.
Yes.
And forcing everyone onto these slow, incredibly expensive back roads.
That is a very apt analogy.
Because the standard diversion is the Cape of Good Hope.
Right.
We are talking about vessels turning around and traveling all the way down the western coast of Africa, around the southern tip, and back up the eastern seaboard.
It is a staggering logistical penalty.
It's massive.
Rerouting around the Cape adds thousands of nautical miles to a journey.
Yeah.
It burns immense amounts of extra fuel, it ties up vessel capacity for weeks longer than scheduled, and it fundamentally wrecks the strict just-in-time delivery models that global trade relies upon.
And while that hurts global trade generally, our notes highlight how this detour uniquely punishes the Horn of Africa.
Yes, very specifically.
And specifically, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a massive economy in the region, but it has one major structural issue. It is entirely landlocked.
Which introduces a profound geographic vulnerability. Ethiopia has no coastline whatsoever.
Zero.
So it is entirely reliant on the port infrastructure of its neighbors, predominantly Djibouti.
Right, to process all of its imports and exports.
Exactly.
So Ethiopia is essentially held hostage by the coastal stability of its neighbors.
That's one way to frame it.
If the ships are taking the long way around the continent and avoiding the Red Sea corridor altogether, Ethiopia feels that delay exponentially. They don't have alternative oceanic access to fall back on.
They are at the absolute mercy of transit corridors they simply do not control.
Right.
When you're landlocked, an external shock to a neighboring port doesn't just delay your goods, it can halt your entire national economic engine.
Because the delays compound.
The delays compound, the storage fees at the transit ports pile up, and the eventual cost of the goods once they finally cross the land border into Ethiopia is inflated beyond measure.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Middle East is not just an abstract zone of conflict across the water. The Middle East is actually an active, aggressive investor inside the Horn of Africa.
The geopolitics of infrastructure investment.
Exactly. Our source material points to a massive influx of foreign direct investment from major Middle Eastern powers.
The main players.
We're talking specifically about the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. They are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the Horn of Africa.
Yes, they are funding heavy port developments.
Like the UAE's massive investments in Berbera.
Right. Sprawling infrastructure projects and even establishing physical military bases.
Like Turkey's presence in Somalia.
Precisely. From a purely developmental standpoint, this influx of capital addresses a critical infrastructure deficit.
They need the money.
They do. The Horn of Africa urgently needs modernized deepwater ports, paved logistics corridors, and upgraded energy grids just to integrate into the global economy.
But taking that kind of money from competing geopolitical rivals, it feels a bit like taking a loan from a mobster.
The strings attached are significant.
Right. The terms are fantastic right up until they aren't.
That is the proxy theater risk the source explicitly warns about.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, when a Middle Eastern power builds a port or a military installation in the Horn of Africa, they are inherently tying that African nation to their own geopolitical sphere of influence.
Okay.
So the historical and current rivalries between states like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are essentially exported directly to the African coastline.
So if a nation in the Horn aligns too closely with one investor to get a port built, they instantly alienate the rivals of that investor.
Exactly. It requires a nearly impossible diplomatic tightrope walk.
Yeah, you can't please everyone.
Local governments are forced to balance the desperate need for capital against the risk of their sovereign territory becoming a secondary battleground for foreign disputes.
A proxy battleground.
Exactly. If tensions boil over between the Middle Eastern investors, the African nations hosting their assets could find themselves caught in the diplomatic crossfire, facing severed ties, pulled funding, or frankly, worse.
And as if proxy politics wasn't enough of a headache, There is a whole secondary layer to the security dilemma.
The maritime security breakdown.
Right, because when conflict distracts international naval coalitions in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the standard security apparatus breaks down, and nature abhors a vacuum.
And in maritime security, a vacuum is immediately filled by the shadow economy.
Piracy. It is essentially the world's most resilient startup sector.
Unfortunately, yes.
The source highlights that whenever there's a breakdown in regional order, we see a direct resurgence in piracy, illicit arms smuggling, and broader illegal activities at sea.
What the data actually points to here is a feedback loop of instability.
A feedback loop.
Yes. When the shadow economy surges, it actively deters legitimate commerce.
Because capital is cowardly.
Very cowardly. It flees from unmanaged risk. The mere threat of piracy forces shipping companies to either hire private armed security details,
Which adds tens of thousands of dollars to a voyage.
tens of thousands, or they avoid the area entirely, pushing those insurance premiums we discussed earlier even higher.
It's a compounding series of headaches. You have delayed shipments, skyrocketing food prices, the diplomatic minefield of foreign investment, and an emboldened pirate economy.
It is a perfect storm.
So what does this all mean? How do these nations avoid simply being collateral damage to geography? Because the source document doesn't just outline the impending doom.
No, it is quite constructive.
It provides a very specific 4-point playbook for resilience.
Mitigation is the key theme here. The Horn of Africa cannot broker peace in the Middle East.
No.
So the focus naturally shifts to internal bulwarking.
Right, building the shield.
Exactly. The first strategy the document identifies is regional cooperation.
Which sounds fantastic in a think tank white paper. But let's be real for a second. These countries have incredibly fraught histories with one another.
But that is the reality, yes.
Border disputes, historical grievances. Getting them to act as a unified economic bloc is a massive hurdle.
It is a monumental challenge. But the source argues it is an existential necessity.
They don't have a choice.
Exactly. Organizations like IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, they exist, but they need to move beyond just diplomatic forums.
Right.
They need to become actionable, integrated economic zones. Because if a shock hits the region, a fragmented group of nations will each suffer individually.
But together.
If they have shared trade agreements, unified customs protocols, and integrated regional security forces, they can actually absorb and distribute that shock.
Creating a larger shield rather than 5 small ones.
Precisely.
Now, the second strategy addresses the inflation of basic necessities directly. Localized food production. The playbook emphasizes moving toward real food sovereignty.
Decoupling the population's caloric survival from the volatility of international shipping.
Which is huge. But again, let's look at the friction here. You can't just wish a wheat field into existence in a region that suffers from chronic aridity and these devastating drought cycles.
No, you cannot. And that is precisely why the document focuses on systemic agricultural overhaul, not just planting more seeds.
It requires capital.
Massive capital. Achieving food sovereignty in the Horn of Africa requires capital-intensive investments in advanced irrigation technologies, drought-resistant crop varieties, and modernized local supply chains.
A total rethink.
Yes. It means shifting entirely from subsistence farming to resilient agribusiness.
Right.
It is difficult, but the alternative, relying on a disrupted Red Sea for your daily bread, is clearly unsustainable.
If they can grow their own food, the panic over a delayed bulk carrier diminishes significantly.
It changes the entire security posture.
So that leads us to strategy number 3, which is aimed squarely at the logistics bottleneck. And it circles back to Ethiopia.
The need for geographic redundancy.
Right. The playbook calls for the aggressive expansion of alternative ports and trade routes.
Relying on a single corridor, for instance, the heavy reliance on the Djibouti to Addis Ababa route is a critical single point of failure.
Right. If that road closes, the country starves. So how do they fix it? Because building a port takes billions of dollars and a decade of engineering.
They look to existing alternatives and underdeveloped corridors.
Okay.
The source highlights the need to connect landlocked markets like Ethiopia to multiple coastal access points.
Right.
This means fully developing links to Berbera in Somaliland.
Yes, where the UAE is investing.
Exactly. Or utilizing the Appaset corridor to connect with the port of Lamu in Kenya.
I see.
If one port or sea lane is compromised by conflict across the water, the internal logistics network should be robust enough to seamlessly reroute freight to an alternative coast.
It is like having 3 different highway detours fully paved, before the main bridge even collapses.
That is exactly what it is.
Now, the capital expenditure for the road and rail networks alone is staggering,
Unbelievably high.
but it's the only way to guarantee economic continuity.
Yes.
And that brings us to the fourth and final pillar of the playbook, which is arguably the most ambitious,
Yeah.
a massive pivot to renewable energy.
We established earlier that the importation of refined fuels is one of the region's greatest vulnerabilities.
It's the Achilles heel.
It is. Fuel drives the cost of transportation, agriculture, basic electricity, everything.
And yet, the Horn of Africa is sitting on a gold mine of untapped natural power.
It truly is.
We're talking about some of the highest solar irradiance levels on the planet, massive wind corridors, and the geothermal powerhouse that is the Great Rift Valley.
The geothermal potential in Kenya and Ethiopia is particularly transformative.
It's always on, baseload power,
Exactly. But the hurdle, as always, is the upfront capital.
because drilling isn't cheap.
Geothermal exploration is incredibly expensive and carries high initial risk. You drill, and sometimes you find nothing. However, the long-term payoff is total energy independence.
And that is the dream. By transitioning to renewables, they aren't just making a climate pledge, they are executing a masterstroke of geopolitical defense.
A completely different way to look at energy.
Right. If your national grid and your local transportation are powered by geothermal and solar energy generated within your own borders, a sudden spike in global oil prices, triggered by a Middle Eastern conflict, barely registers on your economy.
It permanently neutralizes one of the most potent weapons of external economic disruption.
It takes away the leverage.
Yes. If you remove imported fuel from the inflation equation, you instantly stabilize the entire domestic market.
It takes a massive structural weakness and engineers it into a localized strength.
Which is the entire goal of this playbook.
So true.
When we synthesize the entire brief, the prevailing narrative is that geography is destiny, but it does not mandate victimhood.
I like that.
The proximity of the Horn of Africa to the Middle East guarantees that they will always feel the tremors of cross-border conflicts. That won't change.
No.
However, that exact same geography places them along the most lucrative trade routes on Earth.
It's a double-edged sword.
Exactly. If managed correctly through the rigorous application of this four-point playbook, they can leverage that position to build a highly stable, insulated economic bloc.
It requires an unbelievable amount of capital, immense political will, and frankly, historical rivalries being set aside.
None of which is easy.
No, but the blueprint is there. The plan exists. And that leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up.
The bigger picture.
Exactly. We've spent this entire deep dive looking at the Horn of Africa as a historically vulnerable region trying to adapt to external chaos.
Right.
But consider the reality of the 21st century. Global supply chains are breaking down everywhere.
Everywhere you look.
Climate shocks, pandemics, and regional wars are making the old model of hyper-globalized, just-in-time delivery increasingly obsolete.
The world is changing.
It is. So if the nations of the Horn of Africa actually manage to execute this playbook out of pure, urgent necessity, if they successfully build localized food webs, pioneer regional geographic redundancy, and achieve total renewable energy independence, could this historically marginalized region actually become the ultimate survival blueprint for the rest of the world?
That is a profound question.
It really flips the narrative. It is a fascinating question to consider as we all face an increasingly disrupted future. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Keep looking for the hidden currents that drive our world, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.